for chapter 13, I want to read verses 11 through 18, that last section in Revelation 13. John says, "Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. And because of the signs, it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast. It deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast, who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. This morning, we get to talk about the number 666. You ready? Because I know you've heard a lot of things through the years about this. And I want to see, how can I start off by saying, what I want to do is give what I think is a very plausible approach to this number. And if you have a different approach, that's okay. But this is one that I think will make a lot of sense for this particular approach that John's giving in the vision. And this is about the second beast in chapter 13. This is, as you know, one of the most controversial passages and fanciful passages in all the Bible. Fanciful in the sense that people have all kinds of ideas about it. And unfortunately, I think there are many false interpretations, really, wrong interpretations and misappropriations of our text here. As you know, there are wild apocalyptic theories and movies and books that really are not encouraged by this passage. And I want us to try to cut through all of that and see what John is after. In fact, for John and his vision, he's calling for wisdom and understanding. That's the actual wording in the paragraph, not what we would call runaway imagination. People use all the time. Okay, so let's start off. First, John says that talking about this number 666 calls for wisdom. Wisdom is called for when approaching the entire book of Revelation. And this is a key point at some key strategic places in the book of Revelation. And that's probably not the first thing that comes to people's mind. What really comes to people's mind is how crazy the book is, and it calls for all kind of wild theories, when in reality, what John is calling for, when you hear these visions and you see them read, he's calling for wisdom. In Revelation 5:12, you may remember, worthy is the Lamb who receives wisdom. And that presumably is the wisdom, divine wisdom that he receives from God. And we know from 7:12 in Revelation, wisdom is attributed to our God forever. That's what John says. And then one other time in Revelation chapter 17, verse 9, he's going to talk about the woman and the seven mountains. And he says in chapter 17, we'll meet this again. This calls for a mind with wisdom. So very two key points in the book of Revelation where he's actually calling for a mind of wisdom. Wisdom is called for, which means measured discernment that is careful to interpret the times. Now, let's talk about this for a moment, because in our Christian life, we do this all the time. We look at the news, we hear about things, and from the Christian perspective, we engage in what's called kind of a level of prophetic discernment. That we will hear things, we're like, wow, it looks like the devil's in that. We'll make those kind of remarks. Well, what that tells me is you're looking at something that's happening, and from the Christian worldview and your understanding of your faith in God and the world, you know that that's not good. And so we already, we're aware of this measured discernment that is careful to interpret the times, because we do that all the time. And it goes against the idea of promoting fantastic theories, wild apocalyptic scenarios, and movies that have nothing really to do with the book of Revelation. I know it's real popular. A lot of books have been written. A lot of movies have been made. A lot of money's been made. But I'm not quite sure that's what John is after. So notice what else he says. This is fascinating. That this understanding is to allow calculation. And he uses this word. And it seems that at the outset, this understanding things in Revelation is one of the most elusive things for us, because we didn't receive it originally like the seven churches of Asia. And it may seem odd that John's vision calls for a use of the mind and the intellect to calculate something, because the metaphors used up to this point in Revelation have dominated the visions, and the use of imagination has been the main interpretive key. We just kind of go with the images. Well, now he shifts and he says, understanding is where you use the mind, the ability to reason, figure things out, and draw a conclusion. It's the same dynamic that we mentioned earlier in chapter 17, verse 9. Here is the mind which has wisdom, and then he moves into the seven heads or the seven mountains on which the woman sits. So we'll talk about that when we get to chapter 17. Now, John is real clear. This number, when you calculate it, number 666, it's the number of the beast, but also the number of a man. The solution of the 666 riddle has puzzled Christians for centuries. And if you go through, and if you were to read all through history, writings that Christians have made on Revelation chapter 13 and what 666 is, you cannot imagine how many options are out there. It's almost like any person comes up with anything they want. Now, John is going to use, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of calculating. And this is a fascinating term, because it goes to the historical and cultural practice of being involved in something where that when you count, you would use pebbles to count. And you would calculate and compute with pebbles. And sometimes it was even used in the context of where you would vote with pebbles. But it was the idea of using pebbles, laying them out so you could count and calculate something in John's day. So what we note is that this counting is a calculation, which means that you add the letters together of the number 666 in order to arrive at their meaning. And so here is the best guess historically. It's a practice that was known in the ancient world called gematria, where in Hebrew and Greek and other languages, and it's not that way in English, but certain letters of the alphabet would be used for certain numbers. And a real easy illustration is if you do Roman numerals, the X is 10. You know, the V in the alphabet is what? It's a 5. So the ancient world, some of the languages did that. Now in English, we actually have what we call Arabic numerals, so that our letters don't equate to numbers. We don't really do that. So it is a type of code that was used in Revelation, where they would actually use that to calculate. It'd be sort of like in English, if we did create it, you'd go something like this: A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3, and you build your own code through our own alphabet. When the ancient world did this, the name of a person is represented by a number whose letters are represented by the numbers themselves. So John uses this to calculate the number of the beast, and he does it apparently from the Hebrew language. And it's not strange for John to refer to a Hebrew practice or a Hebrew word, because he does in Revelation 16:16. So when we get to chapter 16, we'll talk about that. But when you use this calculation, it comes out being Nero Caesar. And I want you to look at how this is calculated. This is how they would do it. The first letter is the letter N in English. It has an N sound. The second letter is an R. And the third letter is an ending N. So a lot of times Nero would sign his name Neron and have an N on the end of it, which was very common practice. Notice, because it's Hebrew, I don't know if y'all know this, but many of the old Hebrew manuscripts and old Bibles, the original Hebrew text didn't have vowels. Now, I want to challenge you. Can you imagine? And you can actually do it, because I've done this in class with students. Take any Bible verse you want, take all the verses, and take out the vowels, so that all that you have are consonants that show up. It's amazing how you can still read the verse without the vowels. Well, in the pointed text, or the lack of the pointed text in Hebrew, you just have the consonants. So it's Neron, and then the K, the Kof, is worth 100. Same thing as 100. They would use the K sound for the 100. The S is 60. The R is 200. When you add all of those together, it equals 666. And so there are people that really believe that what John is doing, he's using this ancient practice called gematria to use the letters of the alphabet to spell out Nero's name, so that, think about this, the non-Christian hearing this read, and the non-Christian not knowing anything about the book of Revelation, wouldn't pick up on the fact that this is Nero. So when we think about this, here's what one Christian writer said, and I just had to share this. In our day, attempts have been made to link the public figures by name as fulfilling the number 666. Some people tried to prove that it was Putin, others Gorbachev, others Kissinger, and other historical figures. But he says, trying to do that has proven embarrassingly futile. The prophetic significance of 666 is to understand the spirit of the political reality it represents. And this is so true. I mean, this is not foreign to what Revelation does. I want you to think about how many deep spiritual lessons we've already learned, that even though it was originally written for the 7 churches of Asia, these lessons also apply to us, because they're deep spiritual principles that hold true for all time. So the prophetic significance of 666 is to understand the spirit of the political reality it represents. Despotic individuals who use their power to persecute the church and oppress humanity. As you think about it, people would say, well, Hitler might fit into there. Stalin might, Idi Amin might, because they would be excellent examples of this spirit just in the 20th century. And when you look at it, all through history, there have been world leaders that were just like Nero, had the same spirit, hated Christians, tried to wipe them out. So that's what the 666 is all about. Some historians believe that the second beast has an interesting function, and it signals a message. Did you notice verse 14? It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. Many church historians believe that this is going back to the idea that people have cited Nero. Up until the end of the 1st century into the early 2nd, there were people who believed that Nero didn't die. Oh man, we saw him over here. You know what it reminded me of? You know how people for a number of years talked about Elvis sightings. Well, it was the same thing, dynamic with Nero. There were all kinds of Nero sightings into the 2nd century. And some people think that this may be kind of a reference to that because notice the second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. And we know that Nero, all through the Roman Empire, had images set up, and Christians were supposed to fall down and worship to that. And it was as if the image was real. And what's fascinating is some of the prophets of the Greek and Roman religions actually would believe, because they would be in some kind of a worship experience, they actually believed that those idols would talk to them. And so we feel like that probably this is talking about pagans who believed that the idols they worship could actually speak. But they spoke on behalf of Nero. Nero's still speaking. It's kind of like that the second beast is functioning the signal, oh man, it's Nero all over again. And that's how the Christians would feel. Here's something interesting this week I did not know, but I discovered it. And there are places where you can find this. Early Christianity, using this system of the letters, early Christians into the 2nd century delighted in proving to their pagan neighbors that the word Jesus would equal and add up to 888. I didn't know that. But the way they would use the letters, they would put them all down like this and they'd draw the line, the sum. Jesus is 888. Well, that made a great connection for early Christians in the 2nd century because guess what? In some of their writings, Sunday, we call it the first day of the week, and you see that in the book of Revelation. But when you get into the 2nd century, sometimes Christians would call Sunday the 8th day of the week. And you know why? It was a distinction that they did not want their Jewish neighbors to think that they were worshiping on the Sabbath day. No. It's the next day. And sometimes we call it first day of the week. Sometimes we call it day number 8. And so there was, in early Christianity, there's this wonderful connection between Sunday being the 8th day and the name of Jesus being represented by 888. So they were real proud of that. But it's kind of fascinating, and it shows you how numbers and letters were used like this in the ancient world. Now, this is represented, of course, by the second beast. And I shared all that with Wilson. The second beast, look at the description of this second beast. It had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. Now, we're not really sure why. And as with all of the beasts and all of these animals that show up in Revelation, we're not always sure why they're pictured that way, but you can think of various functions. And it's sort of like the lamb is covering up the fact that there's really a beast at work. Some people think that this image that John is using here is sort of like, remember in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he talks about false teachers who come to you, wolves in sheep's clothing. So this may be that kind of dynamic with this picture. Boy, the actions of this beast are something else. It exercises all the authority of the first beast, performs all these great signs, and it reminds me of the verse that we were talking about with Matthew 7:21, Chris, earlier, that Jesus said, well, many will come to me and say, Lord, Lord, did we not cast out demons and perform all these signs, do all these wonderful works in your name? And Jesus says, well, depart from me, you workers of iniquity, because I never knew you. This is the same thing. You've got this emphasis on all these great signs that were duping people, deceiving them. And see, this is the other thing, that the recognition is that it deceives. And this gets at the heart of what Satan is trying to do in the world today. We could have a whole lesson on Satan's attempt to deceive us. And we really have to be on guard, don't we? It's kind of like, have you ever been deceived with your iPhone? That if you punch on this, you can get this reward. And guess what? Have you ever had the experience on your computer, your iPhone, you punch on something and guess what? You get malware. And you're like, oh my goodness, it's going to destroy my phone or my laptop. And you have to take it in and get it worked on, all because something deceived you and it looked awful good and you punched on that. And oh my, you didn't realize what was coming. So this second beast speaks and causes Christians to be slain and causes all the other people to be marked on the right hand or on the forehead with that number. And the impact on the people is quite extraordinary too, because it was the worship of the first beast. And what it seems is that even the succeeding Caesars promoted the worship of Nero. He was kind of the primary one that they worshiped. But he deceived the people into making the image, and then they were marked so that no one could buy or sell unless they had the mark. Archaeologists have found, and I don't know what there's a special term for it, but it's almost like a receipt where you paid homage to Caesar, and it was a written out receipt that you did that, so you were faithful to Caesar, Nero, and when you had that, then you could go shopping, or you could participate in business. And it's interesting that when this second beast is having a marked effect on people, it's so that they could not buy or sell unless they had that mark. Here's what a Christian commentator says, and I think he's really on the mark here. The demand that everyone receive a mark on their right hand or on their forehead could be an allusion to the ancient practice of branding or tattooing people, especially if you were disobedient or if you were loyal to one of the gods and other various religions. If the branding is in mind here, then the beast worshippers are seen as his property. And that was the whole purpose of the ancient world of branding people. If branding of soldiers or religious followers is in view, the worshippers are seen as his faithful followers. And the mark is clearly figurative of the ways in which the state keeps check on whether people submit to compulsory idol worship. Now, you wouldn't think, and today we don't deal with this, but to think that the state would keep up with where you are, what you're saying, what you're doing, is it keeping in line with compulsory worship of the idol? Now, as we continue thinking about this, let's see, that's that statement. I want to say that we need to quit looking for literal 666 in places. The book of Revelation is highly symbolic. You know where this first got me? Years ago, and I don't know if you remember, years ago when I got my first debit card, it was like, oh, wow. I mean, I've moved into the modern world. I went to the bank, and this was amazing. I went up to the counter, and I'll never forget the lady handed my debit card, and she looked at it as, you know, as she handed it to me. And of course, it has the 16 numbers on it, you know. But the final 3 numbers on my debit card was 666. And she went, oh my God, do you want this? And I said, well, yeah. She said, aren't you afraid? I said, no, I'm not going to worship the beast. And then I left, and she was kind of like, but I'll never forget that. She was just astounded that the card came out with 666 on the end. And that's when I began to realize, boy, you know, and it is interesting that just in popular religion and kind of in the culture, there is this idea that 666, and it's interesting that people think about this. It does represent, though, evil, Satan, what he's up to. That's what the symbol is supposed to mean in 666, as it was embodied first in Caesar himself. And 666 is not a chip inserted under the skin with that number. I mean, I'm telling you, there's all kind of crazy things out there. It's not barcodes that are tattooed on your arm. I've seen pictures where people have barcodes tattooed on their arm with 666. They think that's what it is. And I'm sitting there going, okay. Now, there is one redeeming factor of all this stuff. And I want you to think about this. I'm almost kind of like Paul in Philippians 1, where Paul recognized there were people that were preaching the gospel, but they were doing it with a wrong motive, and their desire was to heap problems on him. Paul said, I don't care about that. I'm just glad that the gospel is being preached. And I'm thinking, we would have a hard time with that. If we found out the preacher was preaching with the wrong motive, we would have a hard time with that. But Paul said, I don't care, just so the gospel is being preached. Well, here's my take on all this, and you don't have to agree with it, because there's a lot of fanciful interpretations out there about 666. I guess what I'm most hopeful is, if it ends up helping people realize that they need to get their life right with God because Satan's in the world, I'm okay with that. But I still think people misappropriate it and misunderstand it, okay? So that's kind of my take on this. Now, here's what I got to thinking. Wow, okay, here's what I think John may have come close to saying. I want you to think of the number 777 for the Christian. Oh, okay. And based on what we've already learned from this chapter, notice Christians are men and women of faith who are not going to allow Satan to deceive them. By God's help and our own walk with Jesus and our daily, meditation and devotion time with God or whatever, we have spiritual eyes that are wide open, and we are not going to let Satan deceive us. And Christians don't worship the image. We don't worship anything other than God. And here's the hard one, even from this text. As a Christian, there may come a day when we'll have to die for our faith. Now, there are Christians all over the world dying today. The whole ministry called Voice of the Martyrs, if you've not looked it up on the internet, do that. But they keep track of all over the world where Christians are being martyred. And we take it for granted here in America. But that's a very important thing to think. And where it says the Christians may not be able to buy and sell, we have to understand that we live in a broken world, and there may be cultural restraints on what Christians can do in a pagan culture. There may be. Boy, I don't know if you all caught the news. This was several years ago. I think it was in the Texas area. But there was a mayor of one town that decided that any kind of teaching or preaching from a church that was against the gay lifestyle was hate speech. And that particular leader of that town tried to pass an ordinance that on a particular Sunday, every preacher would turn in their sermon so that it would be deemed whether or not it was hate speech. I don't know if you followed that in the news. Boy, preachers were in an uproar about that. Well, let me tell you, we live in a country where we have freedom that preachers can be in an uproar about that without getting their head cut off. Okay, so we just have to be aware of that. So cultural restraints on what we can do in a pagan culture. We need to hear this. America is not a Christian nation. Now, I know that it was tried to start on Christian principles, but you look across America, I'm sorry. By and large, I think it's a pagan nation. It's very hedonistic, very materialistic, and God didn't, how can I say it? Jesus was not crucified on the cross for America to be saved. No. Jesus died on the cross for the church, for men and women of faith to be saved. I just hope and pray that our pagan culture can be turned around. But regardless, we just have to be aware that the culture is not going to always be recipient to the Christian faith. So let's end. How is all of this relevant for me today? Well, first, the whole passage, this is quite remarkable. The whole passage calls for responsible interpreters of the Bible not to be decoding a puzzle and finding every conceivable event or person to match to 666, but rather to be aware of the embodiment of evil in high places that threaten one's commitment to Christ, and that's in every generation. The second is that the mark on the right hand or on the forehead, that presumably that's 666, it's not really a literal number or marking. It again points out very clearly how symbolic everything is in the book of Revelation and not to be taken literally. Rather, this is a way of saying that Satan has marked his people, his own people, for his purposes. Number 3, being a Christian may have daily marketplace consequences. And as time goes on, that may be stronger and stronger and stronger. We just have to be prepared for it. Number 4, vital, significant interpretive exercise. This is looking at this verse for all of the book of Revelation in the Bible. We have to be very cautious in claiming certainty beyond what is written. We have to look at the evidence within the verse. We have to keep the verse in its literary and historical context. We look for spiritual truths and moral principles to live by. And then last of all, and I love this part, and we don't have time to do this morning, but I want to encourage you. Do you know that when you study the Bible, you can prayerize your study, which means taking the language of that paragraph, Revelation 13, verses 11 through 18. Now, Beth doesn't know this and Nancy doesn't know it yet, but on Tuesday evening, our small group, we're going to do this exercise. You take the paragraph, you let it become the stuff of your prayer life. Isn't that interesting? So, in a way, this is an amazing passage because it really says, even though Satan thinks he has the upper hand and he's trying to mark everybody, just wait. Wait and see how the rest of the book of Revelation unfolds and what happens to this beast and those who are marked with the 666, because this is in contrast, and this is a whole nother lesson for those who are marked on their forehead with the seal of God. And that's why I just kind of tongue-in-cheek, I said, well, maybe those who are marked on the forehead with the seal of God, maybe it's with 777. He doesn't tell us, so I'm just throwing that out there. But God marks those who are his own people. And so you and I this morning, we're marked for God, not for Satan. So this morning as we end the lesson here, I know it's kind of an unusual one, but hopefully it was enough to give you some solid things to think about so that you don't feel at the mercy of every single wild theory you see about 666 out there, because I guarantee you there's a ton of them.